On December 14, 2018, Fox News published an article titled, "Venezuelans Regret Gun Ban, a Declaration of War Against an Unarmed Population." The article discusses how Venezuela continues to crumble under the socialist dictatorship of President Nicolas Maduro. The focus quickly shifts to a 6-year-old gun control bill that strips citizens of their weapons. While a small number of people voluntarily handed in their guns, the vast majority of guns were seized by force. The article quotes Javier Venegas, a former Venezuelan who points out that if guns were still allowed, they would have enabled the Venezuelans to protect their freedom, or at least be able to try and defend it against the government. He later notes that Venezuelans didn't care enough about it. People never would have believed they needed to defend themselves against the government. The article appears to emphasize the importance of an armed population by noting that since April 2017, almost 200 pro-democracy protesters in Venezuela, armed mostly with stones, were shot dead by government forces in brutal retaliation to their call to end the oppressive socialist regime. According to David Kopel, a policy analyst, this is an illustration of what happens when citizens are not allowed to stand up against a corrupt government. It is also noted that the gun control measures were portrayed as something positive. The bill was sold to the population as a hardline effort to improve security and sharply reduce crime. Unfortunately, given the increasing violent crime rates, it appears as if the opposite has actually happened. What this has led to is a situation where only the government, or those who support it, are armed, and citizens are left in a situation where they are unable to defend themselves. It may have also led to the unintended consequence of leading to more police officers getting murdered, as criminals kill them with the intent of taking their guns. It's also noted that criminals are still able to get weapons on the black market, creating a situation where those who should not have guns still have access to them. This article, which detailed the failed gun control measures which had been implemented by a corrupt government, was picked up by a handful of other news segments. For example, Tucker Carlson did a news segment in which he quoted this article. His main point, it seems, was to appeal to Venezuela, which he referred to as a failed socialist country, as a warning sign for the U.S. When discussing the gun ban, Tucker claims that in Venezuela, the point was not to make people safer, but to disarm the public. He also mentions that nearly 200 protesters have been murdered by the government's security forces and that Venezuela has a high murder rate. This is then used to lead us into his interview, which focuses on gun control measures in New Jersey. This appears to cause the viewer to be skeptical about what is happening in the U.S. and to give people a sense of what going down the gun control road can actually lead to. Breitbart also published an article which drew on the Fox News report. A great deal of focus is placed on how Venezuelans face threats from their own government. It's also noted that there's a surging violent crime rate, a fact which may imply that gun control doesn't actually make people safer. In contrast to the gun control measures in Venezuela, it's noted that, in the United States, the Founding Fathers put the Second Amendment in place for the explicit purpose of guaranteeing the citizens could defend themselves from their own government. Such is portrayed as a safeguard against the turmoil that is unfolding in Venezuela, driven to a large extent by a government that is free to oppress an unarmed population. The article also quotes James Madison, who emphasizes that the government is supposed to be subordinate to the will of the people, a framework that is kept in check by an armed citizenry. In a similar fashion, a handful of other outlets reported on the matter. The Daily Wire notes that the Fox article offers a compelling case for gun rights that includes the insights of an exiled Venezuelan dissident forced to watch as his fellow citizens are crushed by the increasingly tyrannical and brutal socialist government. Similarly, Range 365 picks up on the Fox News report and notes that, in 2012, then-President Hugo Chavez banned firearm ownership by private citizens in Venezuela, leaving the unarmed populace unable to defend themselves from criminals and corrupt government officials alike. In the years following, the crime rate and the government abuses increased at an unprecedented rate. It also adds that the unrest in Venezuela shows the importance of bearing arms and the ability to defend oneself against bad actors, be they government or civilian. Hot Air also reported on the matter. Part of its article lists what's going on in Venezuela, and then offers links showing similar things happening in the US. In the last paragraph, it uses Venezuela as a warning for the US by saying, if you're watching what's happening under expanding gun control programs in Democrat/socialist-run blue states these days, consider the end game. And to do so, look no further than Venezuela. Likewise, Liberty Nation reports on the self-destructive complacency of Venezuela, saying that Venezuelans, for the most part, didn't see much need for owning guns to defend against tyranny. Now they know better, and some are offering words of warning via interviews with Fox News. The article closes by cautioning that, while it may be tempting to say we're a long way from Venezuela, it always starts somewhere. Venezuelans have been conditioned to trust their government entirely, so they didn't realize what they were losing in time to stop it. When the anti-gun left tells you how much safer we all are without firearms, keep this in mind. Giving in on even one gun control measure is the beginning of liberty's death spiral. With each new restriction, we lose our freedom at an accelerated rate. It isn't just the right for some people to have guns that keeps us free. It's the cultural understanding that the reason we bear arms, to begin with, is to stop government tyranny. Let's learn from Venezuela's example, so we don't become them. Other articles discuss this topic prior to and independent of the Fox News report. For example, Bearing Arms criticizes the socialist country, noting that the country of Venezuela is anything but a free state. While it managed to function as a socialist state so long as the oil industry was propping up its collectivist economy, things were relatively okay, so far as socialist countries go. However, the moment oil stopped keeping everything afloat, the country went to hell in a handbasket faster than you can say, oops. Later on it adds that Venezuela is an absolute hellhole right now, and part of the reason why is because civilians don't have the means to defend themselves, period. In similar fashion, Louder with Crowder discusses some of the problems that Venezuela is facing. Afterwards, it notes that Venezuela is a lesson for the rest of the free world, one that shows the true face of socialism. It also adds that socialism and anti-gunness go hand in hand because socialism seeks complete control of its participants and their belongings, especially all of the guns. The moral of the story is crystal clear and relevant. Gun rights matter. They're necessary to fight off the grabby-handed socialist turdberries. Venezuelans don't have a Second Amendment with which to protect themselves. Thus, they have zero guns with which to protect themselves. Venezuela and its socialist government are exactly why the United States has the Second Amendment. Breitbart also covered the topic in a number of articles. One suggests that banning guns has turned them into a valuable commodity, which in turn has driven some people to kill the police and steal their firearms. Another describes how the repressive socialist government is urging civilians to surrender their weapons to government officials in what they claim is an attempt at reducing the nation's astronomical murder rate. While the motive for this is portrayed as noble, namely to promote peace in Venezuela, the article points out the ineffectiveness and unintended consequences of this approach. Yet another article notes that guns are being administered to government supporters as a means of undermining those who oppose the government and are demanding a fair election process. At the same time, it's also interesting to see where this specific topic appears to have received far less attention. For example, when I searched the phrase Venezuela gun ban into Google, none of the results on the first few pages were from CNN or MSNBC. Searching Venezuela gun ban into MSNBC's search engine produced no results for me as well. At CNN, although the phrase produced some results, most of them seemed irrelevant to the topic at hand. One, however, was related to gun violence and did mention the situation in Venezuela. One person is quoted as saying, "If restricting access to firearms made people safer, then Venezuela should be a utopia. The country banned the private ownership of guns in 2012, and then later enforced that ban with gun confiscation. And yet they now have a murder rate that is almost 20 times higher than the murder rate in the US. On the other hand, another interviewee notes that, where there are more guns, more people get shot by them. To the credit of this author, the article did seem to offer some different perspectives on the matter. What's interesting about this story is that the topic of Venezuela, gun control, and crime is covered, but it's a bit more difficult to find since it isn't the story's primary focus, as was the case with the previous articles I discussed. Moreover, there isn't much said about skepticism towards the government, which was a major point of emphasis in the other articles as well. I also tried to do some more in-depth searching in CNN for other coverage on this topic. There were some articles about what was going on in Venezuela. However, it was interesting to consider what points they did not bring up. For example, one article discusses the crisis in Venezuela, noting that, to silence critics, the government has conducted widespread arrests and other repression. Since 2014, we have been documenting the violent response of security forces to protests, with beatings and arrests of peaceful demonstrators and even bystanders, and torture and detention. With that said, nothing seems to be said about how the gun ban may have created a situation in which the government is capable of abusing its power unopposed. The country also isn't labeled as socialist, preventing that term from being associated with the problems that it is facing. Another article reported on a poll that concluded that Venezuela was the world's most dangerous country. It notes that Venezuela has been in a state of crisis for years, roiled by political turmoil, mass protests, food and medical shortages, a soaring drug trade, and one of the highest homicide rates in the world. However, unlike other articles, it does not incorporate the ideas of the gun ban, the right to protect oneself from criminals, or say that Venezuela is a socialist country. Likewise, another story discusses some of the takeaways we can learn from what's happening in Venezuela, especially with regards to the government's corruption. The article notes that all populist autocrats try to foment divisions, find scapegoats, and inflame their backers against their critics. But the path from populist autocracy to full-fledged dictatorship has one indispensable element: taking control of the judiciary and politicizing law enforcement. It's interesting to note that the move towards a dictatorship is not said to involve disarming the public. This reflects a somewhat different focus compared to the articles I mentioned towards the beginning of this video. It is also noted that Nicolas Maduro, the former and now currently contested president of the country, was a member of the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, and that this party controlled much of the legislature. However, the problems associated with his and the government's abuse of power doesn't seem to be directly connected with socialism in a more general sense. Comparing all these articles brings some interesting contrasts into focus. Some appear to make Venezuela's gun control a central point worth focusing on. They also suggest that it is connected with a number of other factors. For example, it's pointed out that crime hasn't gone down, and instead, homicides have increased. Some also point out that it hasn't stopped criminals from accessing guns on the black market, and instead prevents law-abiding citizens from protecting themselves. It's also used to argue that the gun control laws allow the government to oppress its citizens without armed opposition, thereby creating a situation where it is not held accountable by the people it's supposed to represent. Criticisms of the government are also accompanied by labeling Venezuela as socialist, thereby tarnishing that approach towards governing a country. These ideas tend to cluster together and are often accompanied by warnings to the United States. The dire conditions facing Venezuelans are used to caution people against giving up their right to bear arms, and to deter our country from placing more control over society into the government's hands. What is perhaps noteworthy is that some of the websites that covered this perspective focused on gun-related issues. For example, Range 365 discusses gun basics, different types of gun-related gear, shooting tips, and gun reviews. Similarly, Bearing Arms covers gun-related news, gear, and how guns can save lives. The perspective that these websites advanced on the Venezuela topic seemed to align with their general themes. Others, however, seem to place less of a focus on guns, in spite of openly discussing the problems Venezuela faces and the problem of government corruption. They also didn't bring up socialism, portray it in a negative light, or advance an attitude of skepticism towards the government. This implies that they are advancing a different explanation for why Venezuela is struggling. Interestingly, other news outlets seem to have little on this specific topic altogether. It appears to me that the degree of coverage on this topic appeared to correlate with the degree to which people are pro-gun, for a lack of a better term, and in favor of a smaller government. I of course want to note that these conclusions are only based on the limited searching that I have done, and a more thorough investigation on all the articles and videos on Venezuela may yield additional or different insights. I also want to point out that while the articles I discuss typically place the blame of Venezuela's conditions on the government, whether it be general corruption, its socialist practices, or its gun control measures, there are other outlets which emphasize the role of the U.S. in damaging Venezuela. While this isn't the main focus of this video, I do think that it's at least worth mentioning that the U.S.'s foreign policy is yet another variable that may be worth considering when it comes to assessing Venezuela's situation. So I think I'll wrap things up here. Hopefully this offered a helpful overview of how this topic has been covered. At the heart of this issue seems to be the task of explaining why Venezuela is struggling, as well as whether and to what extent their gun control measures play a role in their current situation. When formulating our views, I think it's important for us to consider what variables matter and how much they matter. For example, it may be the case that, while the gun control laws had some impact on the situation in Venezuela, certain news outlets may overplay its role, and the majority of the problems are really caused by bad economic planning. Or, perhaps bad economic planning is secondary to U.S. foreign policy and government corruption. What I think is important to realize is that different variables are not necessarily mutually exclusive. There can be multiple factors that all contribute to Venezuela's plight. At the same time, just because a number of factors play a role in Venezuela's situation does not necessarily mean that they are all equally at fault. And as far as the media goes, it's worth keeping in mind that, depending on where you get your information from, some factors may be emphasized and perhaps overhyped, while others are downplayed, explained away, or even neglected altogether. While a lot more could be said on this matter, I think I'll close with that. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.